Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the World Bank Group Youth Summit on Smarter Cities for a Resilient Future. I hope you had a thrilling evening of exploring DC or sleeping. Both are equally acceptable. So just 2 other milestones that we're noting today. Today is International Day of Persons with Disabilities, a day to mark decades of awareness raising and change making to improve the situation of and the fight for equal opportunities for persons with disabilities. Now, there will be a fair and an event in the atrium today, so be sure to check it out this afternoon. Today is also day 2 of the UN Climate Change Conference, COP25, taking place in Madrid. And climate change, as you've seen, is at the heart of many of the conversations that we're having here. It was a pleasure meeting some of you at the reception yesterday, and I was overwhelmed to realize the number of stories and narratives that are in the room right now, coming from New York, Nigeria, Georgia, India, Kenya, and beyond. Thank you for being here. You truly make our Youth Summit world go around. I also want to acknowledge our online audience and to those of you who've been sharing some fantastic tweets using hashtag WBG Youth Summit. Our communications lead, Melinda Wood, has been diligently watching and retweeting you. So let's keep her busy. Let's keep tweeting. Also, did you know that so many of our country office colleagues are doing the case challenge with you? So when you're in those rooms, you're not alone. Shout out to Belarus, Malawi, Liberia, Jamaica, and El Salvador country offices who are joining you in this. Now later today, we're going to be inviting a few of you on stage to make 1-minute pitches to tackle a smart city challenge of your choice. What do you want your story to be up here? Think about it. Food for thought as we move on through the new day, brimming with new thinking and new faces. To set the stage for today, it is my pleasure to invite on stage our opening speaker, Sameh Wahba. Sameh is the Global Director for Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience, and Land at the World Bank. Under him, the team also covers territorial development, geospatial issues, and results-based financing. Let's welcome him on stage.
Good morning. You sound like you had a fantastic day yesterday, so I hope to be able to build a little bit on that momentum and to share with you a little bit about what we're doing on smart and resilient cities at the World Bank. So the title of this presentation is a little bit about geospatial technologies and what we're doing at the World Bank on building smart and resilient cities. And in many ways, these are the 4 major trends that are shaping the world in which we live today. I mean, basically, urbanization and demographics, climate change, conflict, together with technologies. So if you look at it, in 1970, the world was practically 1/3 of its population was living in urban areas and 2/3 were living in rural areas. We expect to go by 2050 to the opposite of that. So as of now, we're adding the equivalent of 2.5 billion people in urban areas between now and 2050. It's more or less the equivalent of 1 Turkey per year, every year between now and 2050. Now, demographics are also changing significantly the way the world in which we live today, the way it's operating. So as you know, aging is a very important factor. You will just look at some of these statistics, which is the percentage of the population, over 65 relative as a percentage of the workforce, and it gives you a ratio of, the working population versus the population that's retiring in Japan and in many other countries. And these factors are not just shaping, the demographics of our world, they're also in many ways shaping the cities in which we live in today. Cities, for those of you who have traveled to Tokyo or other cities in Japan, you'll start noticing that there's an increasing concentration or density that's evolving around transit nodes as older people prefer, to basically shed the cars and start using public services, public transport systems. It influences service delivery and so on and so forth. You add to that migration, whether it's the economically induced migration or climate-induced migration and otherwise, and again, it's having an important effect on the world in which we live today. Conflict is adding also a significant share of a displaced population. There's close to 70 million people who are internally displaced and refugees, and between 60 to 80%, we lack precise statistics, but between 60 and 80% of these live in cities. So it's becoming increasingly an urban phenomenon. Now you add in climate change with the increasing severity and frequency of disasters emerging from extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change. The amount of losses and damages that are happening to infrastructure are increasing. And as the world is urbanizing, it means there is an increasing concentration of people and assets living in urban areas that are vulnerable to risk. So where does technology fit in? We used to live in this paradigm at some point in time, or maybe that's the older one like me who were faced with these types of dilemmas, which is, you can't have it your way. You can't have good, fast, and cheap services. If you get something that's good and cheap, it won't be fast, and so on and so forth. But actually, technology has enabled us to resolve this dilemma, and geospatial technologies have allowed us to have basically good, fast, and cheap data that will enable us to improve service delivery. So we're talking about data emerging from drones, from satellite imagery, from big data, from cell phone records, etc. That has made a revolution in planning and the delivery of services. So this geospatial revolution, with its many layers, whether it's capturing, tenure patterns, whether it's capturing infrastructure services, whether it's capturing all other layers of information that are available in the city, are totally changing the way we plan for service delivery, the way we deliver services, the way we strengthen resilience, and also the way we enhance revenues with which to finance better services. So let me walk you through a few examples of projects that we've done at the World Bank that have used that wide array of tools at our disposal. So the first example is in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And this is crowdsourcing to create the first flood maps. So the city of Dar es Salaam basically floods every year, and the entire city center totally immerses with water. There's a large amount of informal settlements that are encroaching out there that get flooded year in, year out, together with a solid waste management problem and an infrastructure and service delivery problem. Now, we had no clue about flood maps until one of our projects has basically leveraged the power of youth and community leaders, and created a crowdsourcing platform for them to contribute to geotag flood points within the city, and this is how the city looks like when it floods. So they started basically geotagging the flood points and populating them on an OpenStreetMap. And in fact, during the 3 months of this exercise, about a large majority of the wards of the city of Dar es Salaam were mapped. 20,000 flood points were populated on this OpenStreetMap, and it was in fact the most vibrant OpenStreetMap community in the world at this time. So how did that information become useful? It was used as a basis for creating the first flood map of the city, but also the first participatory plan that involves the community to try to understand their preferences in terms of the improvement of this area, the reduction of the flood problem, so that when you come up with a solution, it's an integrated solution, because solving a flooding problem is not just building flood protection infrastructure, it's also solving the garbage collection problem, because they tend to clog that flood protection infrastructure. It's also resolving the urban growth problem, because having encroachments within the flood pathways also further exacerbates the problem. So the result is this first flood map and a participatory plan for the improvement of Dar es Salaam. We stay in Tanzania, we go to Zanzibar, and this is the use of drones to create the first maps of Zanzibar. Again, the 2 islands of Zanzibar have not been mapped for over 60 years, and literally within 6 months worth of work, they happened within 1 year because you had to get permits in between to fly the drones, but within the equivalent of 6 months of flying the drones and processing the imagery, the entirety of the 2 islands of Zanzibar were mapped. And for that, you train community members to be drone operators, you train community members to process the images that the drones produce, so that you can get basically a foundation to use for planning, for the acquisition and the processing of the data, and then its use for a variety of uses. One of which was to try to understand basically the urbanization patterns of Zanzibar. So here, to our great surprise, we've discovered that almost 1/3 of the buildings in Zanzibar are either unbuilt or incomplete. So, its foundations emerging, but the buildings are incomplete. It allowed us to use these maps in urban planning. For the first time, you can guide an urban development process by understanding where the urban growth is happening, where are the houses settling, what is the relationship with the infrastructure, do they lead the infrastructure, do they lag the infrastructure. You can start create the first cadastral map for revenue collection, and you can also deploy the drones the day after a flood so that you can get an idea of where are the areas that have flooded, and you can deploy support as well. A third example is our Resilient Housing Retrofit program. And here it is the combination of using a camera that's mounted on a car to give you a street image, combined with a drone to give you an aerial view, and then you combine the two to create a three-dimensional understanding of the built area in a city, and then with artificial intelligence to convert this data that you see, the images, into recognizable risk patterns. So in this case, we wanted to know what type of buildings might be exposed or might be most at risk if you have a disaster coming from an extreme weather event, whether it's a cyclone or an earthquake. So by looking at the types of openings that the windows had, the type of cantilevers, you can understand what type of buildings are likely to be more at risk. And by deploying this technology, I mean, literally within 2 to 3 weeks, you can map an entire city that's the size of, 500,000 population city, and you can start defining patterns of where are the buildings with the most likelihood of vulnerability in the case of an extreme weather event. And then, in order to test the validity of the survey, you send the actual surveyors to look at these buildings to try to see if they're false positive, false negatives, what's the percentage of those buildings that the algorithm detected as potentially at risk are as determined by a surveyor to be at risk. And we found that we get ratios of 80 to 90%. So it's not perfect. It's not going to make you a detection of building by building that is likely to get exposed, but it gives you a sense of the overall vulnerability to help government think about decisions, about incentivizing, for instance, homeowners to improve their housing, both for livability, but also for resilience. Another example is the city scan approach that we've developed under our City Resilience program. And this is basically going and harvesting all available geospatial information out there in the public domain and using that information to create layers to help city planners to plan. So for instance, you pick up satellite imagery that gives you a sense of the urban extent, which is the urbanized area. You use that combined with images of land covers, with population density, and then you overlay these on top of risk maps, like flooding maps in this case, and then you end up having basically an understanding of the urban growth of a city, relationship to infrastructure, relationship to flooding. Where are the areas that you're supposed to protect in order not to build on? Where are the areas where you should be encouraging population patterns so that you put people away from harm's way? That's the kind of information that's available out there, but the ability to layer this, combine it, and avail it to planners so that they can use it as an input for planning, as opposed to doing very costly surveys, saves time and accelerates a planning process that is much more, if you will, evidence-based. We've taken this one step forward in our work in Indonesia, the City Planning Lab, where we're using satellite imagery to help us on a lot of analytics, like land suitability tools, urban performance, urban extent, and then layering these with some of the key issues. So for instance, in the city of Jakarta, we know that the city has a land subsidence problem. This is the fact because of excessive groundwater abstraction, because of the amazing amount of individualized wells that are available in the city. People are abstracting groundwater at a very rapid pace. The city is sinking. Now, we can measure this sinking actually with satellite image together with radars that measure the extent to which the city is sinking every year. So we could map that a city like Jakarta is sinking 10 to 15 centimeters in certain critical areas per year. Means it can sink a meter over a 10-year period unless this phenomenon is addressed. But most importantly, it's about also building the systems. Getting all this data and working with it is one thing, but building institutions, building the regulations for data sharing, etc., is critical. In Haiti, where we lacked survey maps and surveys for transportation, we've used cell phone data records in large aggregate form, anonymized from any private information, to basically detect mobility patterns. So basically, your cell phone, as you're moving across a city, talks. Your cell phone keeps talking to a cell phone tower at any moment in time, and then as you move from one place to the other, you catch the next cell phone tower, and so on. So you can basically detect the mobility across a city, and when you aggregate that, you understand the way people move from one place to the other in the city. The places where they are static in the morning are places where they live, the places where they spend the majority of the working hours during the days, the places where they work, and then vice versa, they return home, etc. But it gives you an idea of where people live, where people work, and commuting patterns, and it explains to you a lot of things about how the city operates as well. Because when you have in a given city, like Nairobi for instance, when you have a combination of limited public transportation systems together with limited available road space for commuting, and you have implications not just on mobility and access to jobs, you have implication on the overall labor market and the way it functions in a city. So in Nairobi, to give you an example, half of the population walks to work every day. Now, with a city as sprawling as Nairobi, when you walk to work, you do 4 or 5 kilometers per hour. From any moment in time, when you look at the spatial distribution of jobs, the most you can access in terms of a job in the city, if you walk to work for 1 hour, is basically 11% of the jobs. If you do the same thing on the Matatu, which is their minibus, because of the congestion, you can only access 20% of the jobs in the city. So this is an example of cities, where mobility is starting to affect economic opportunities for everyone. And that's the type of analytics that these types of surveys can help us with. And they help us also to understand that in cities like Cap-Haïtien and in a city like Port-au-Prince in Haiti, the labor market is very local because the commuting distances are very short. So people basically are more or less working within a kilometer away from where they live. And again, that's a limitation of the mobility pattern within a city and the ability of people to access jobs beyond a radius that's very localized. So it's the difference between a city, if you will, and an aggregate group of villages cooperating together, because if you do not have access to all the opportunities that the city offers, then the city is failing in its ability to bring, if you will, the shared prosperity that it's known to bring. Lastly is the work on Earth observation that we've done in partnership with the European Space Agency. I've explained the top graph is my favorite. The top one to the left-hand side is my favorite one. That's the land subsidence of Jakarta. I mean, the places that are marked in red are sinking basically the equivalent of 10-15 centimeters per year, as I mentioned. But you get a lot of other things. You can measure air pollution in a city. You can measure the urban extent and the way a city is growing over time. You can compare that growth with the infrastructure to see if a city is developing informally and then the infrastructure is retrofitted at a high cost, or infrastructure is planned and then the city is growing afterwards. And all these are the types of tools that we were not, aware that, 10 years ago, we could not imagine the amount of, if you will, data that's available to help us in a planning and in a service delivery process. So that's example of the multiple layers that can emerge out of satellite imagery just by virtue of, understanding the layers of infrastructure, understanding flood risk, etc. That's an example, that's an animated example of the growth of a city like Shanghai in terms of an urban extent over time. As you see, again, the frequency and the high resolution of this satellite imagery enable us to understand literally how cities are growing. These maps are generated literally every day. Now, this said, I've walked you through a great array of examples, from crowdsourcing to drones to satellite imagery, etc. But the reality is, technology is obviously necessary and is critical for transformation, but as you can imagine, is not really sufficient. The first thing that you need is really to understand the needs of your client. Our client, our mayors, our local governments, what is it that their needs, and the communities. So we've been doing a lot of this because, if we don't understand the types of challenges that our clients and partners in cities and in communities are grappling with, there's not much that we can harness this technology to resolve in terms of a planning process. So that's one example. We work together with the IFC, with Lisa and her team, on bringing some of our city clients that we service both as bank and IFC to a co-creation example, we use the Smart Cities venue in Barcelona, and we get them basically a group of participants in the smart city that represent public sector, private sector, civil society. You have mayors, you have chief resilience officers, you have people from the private sector, people leading smart cities institutes in their countries, coming to co-create solutions for the specific problem of this mayor. So we've done it last year for Belgrade, this year we've done it for Izmir. But in general, I mean, working around, ensuring the participation of the community, whether through processes, like in Brazil, the participatory budgeting, where you get the community to vote on their priorities for the use of a part of the municipal budget, or in a place like Korea, the mayor has made a big effort to try to have, grievance redress mechanisms and basically systems to understand the community's need becomes really critical. The second thing, besides understanding the needs of your clients, is obviously building local capacity. And our Resilience Academy in Africa, as you've seen from the work on drones, is really focused on that. It's focused on getting basically teenagers, on university students, high school students, to train them on data acquisition methods, on operating drones, on processing the imagery with drones, so that they can contribute also to the generation of this data. And it's helping to create enterprises a lot. As well. And this effort has helped us, digitize, over 1.5 million buildings in Africa. 1,000 university students have received training and internships, and so on and so forth, and have resulted in a significant expansion in the mapping that we could generate on the basis of drones. And lastly, as I mentioned in that case of Indonesia earlier, the most important thing is really to build systems. This data, who is owning this data, who's responsible for this data, where it should be placed, what are the protocols for its sharing, what are the protocols for its updating, what is their capacity in order to basically work with that data and plan on it, and the systems, the institutions, the policies, etc., that could help create a system for municipal data infrastructure that could help create cities that are smart and resilient. So I hope with that I've walked you a little bit through some of the work that we do at the bank, some of the challenges that they face, and some of those key requisites so that we can harness the power of technology to ensure that we bring better planning, better service delivery, better revenue enhancement, and better resilience for our cities towards a resilient future. Thank you very much. Sure. I'd be happy to take questions or clarifications.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Shoshana Cohen, and right now I am working on a federal government mapping program with the American government. And my question is about stakeholder engagement and getting that buy-in from the local community to build those maps. How have you encountered these communities, and maybe if they didn't want to or didn't find the need or the importance to crowdsource these maps with you, what tools or strategies did you take hold of?
Okay, I'll take them one by one. So in this particular case, to use the example of Dar es Salaam, I think you rely, there you have a very active and vibrant local government, including at the ward level, that have been brought about. And clearly there has been a distrust with the community, because this is a place in the heart of Dar es Salaam that floods year in, year out. And the community is distrustful that basically what local government will want to do is come and basically remove everybody, to create open spaces, etc. So here, when the community understood that the purpose of this is really to come up with a participatory plan to define, they started building the trust with local government, seeing that this data actually, that they will be the ones generating it, that it is going to be resolving a data gap that local government has not been able to address. The same thing is in other places in Uganda and elsewhere. We've worked with Shack Dwellers International, which organizes slum dwellers into groups and federations that can start creating the maps of their informal settlements, which usually when you see a map in many of the developing country cities, you find little blank spots, and these obviously detect where the informal settlements are. So here it was about, putting your settlement on the map, ensuring that it becomes part of, if you will, that permanent representation of the city. It's a right to the city type approach that you find in places like Latin America. And I think by working in conjunction with the community leader, developing that trust, bringing in local government, and working with them, step by step in a transparent way, that the process of doing this is identifying what could be the solutions in terms of densification, that, you're going to work on resettling everybody in situ. Obviously, there will be houses that will be beyond a level of risk that is tolerable, but how can you find, a densification approach to work on resettling people within the same community starts getting you a long way. But this is something that takes time and is not an easy thing to do.
Thank you.
So, hello, my name is Riwa Al-Masri. I'm from Lebanon and I work as a behavioral economist. So, my question is similar to my colleague before me. So, how to ensure proper citizen participation along the entire way? So, especially when it comes to long-term planning and strategic planning. So, one of the issues that Brazil uses is participatory budgeting. So, what has the World Bank offered in terms of mechanisms that would ensure proper participation from the entire stakeholders across the process and across to give feedback to the current planning that is happening?
So again, citizen engagement for us is, one of the top priorities within the World Bank. So ensuring citizen engagement in terms of not just, subsequent to the implementation to understand the grievances, etc., which is part, if you will, of our social safeguards, if you want, but it is about really building systems for this participation to enhance the planning process, and this is something that we're required to do. In the same way that, you have to have, a focus on climate, you have to have a focus on citizen engagement, on gender, and these are part of our corporate priorities. So we strive to do that. Now, the moment you work in an urban area, this is no longer something that we do because of a corporate priority. This is something that you do for the success of the intervention. If you don't bring people about, these projects will fail. It will just take, two people to start complaining of not being involved for the whole project to be able to come, if you will, to start nosediving. So this process, and this is something that we work with our clients, within cities and local government to try to figure out. Now, you will always hear a client that will say, but citizen engagement, we're going to start a 2-year planning process. By the time I'm done with producing the plan, it's going to be my successor, mayor that will implement the plan. So here you start figuring out a way of, as you're embarking on the more intractable planning processes that require, citizen participation, that you can identify a few quick wins that you can start implementing, quick wins that do not necessarily have a major social or environmental impacts, but that can provide a visible improvement in the city, that there is progress. So it builds that trust of that local government to work with you in a participatory process on a more intractable problem, whether it's a waste problem or a flooding problem, etc. But they see that there is action also starting to happen at small scale, certain surgical intervention, but that are visible to create this momentum.
Thank you for a very informational presentation. I have 2 questions. My first question is, I know you've worked a lot on the urbanization and reutilization of the land. And yesterday we also heard from many World Bank professionals about the efforts of World Bank on scaling their program. For example, if you have succeeded in one project in one region and you want to reapply to another region, I was wondering from your experience with urbanization, reutilization, rearrangement, would that a possibility to scale the previous project and outcome? My second question is, I very much agree with your point about hearing the needs of the local communities and really understand the structures of local government. But I'm just wondering, in many places, what if the people aren't aware of the needs they need? In that case, how do you make sure you really improve their living standards, you improving their communities, even though they may not have the awareness of the needs to improve?
Okay.
Together?
Mm-hmm. And you have a...
Sorry?
pen so I can jot. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So, good morning. My name is Mitali, and I'm an economist with the Asian Development Bank. And my question is two parts. Firstly, what is the typical budget of these interventions? Because, if we're sort of going in and doing a pilot, then, how much would it cost someone from the ADB or the World Bank to actually put this in place? Second, when we do exit, how do we ensure the financial sustainability of the intervention? How do we ensure that this will actually continue in the same sort of path that we left it at, let's say, 3 years in or 5 years in? How do we then, make sure it lasts?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shibi, and I'm an architect and an urban planner from India. My question is, sort of based on your experience, how do you try to curb urban sprawl, especially in developing cities? Because I come from Chennai, and Chennai just faced a horrible flood, and now it's going through a drought situation as well. So this is an extreme situation in just a matter of 2 years. And ultimately, when Chennai got the drought situation sorted, the city's per capita decreased, and people have stopped basically investing into the city. So in terms of to come back to track and in terms to reduce urban sprawl, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nino. I'm from Georgia, and I'm an MPA student in Indiana University. And my question is, what do we do in countries that don't have access to such technologies or don't have enough resources to develop such technologies in their countries? Do we leave them behind, or is there any other opportunities for them to develop smart technologies? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. So maybe very quickly, because I'm realizing I'm a bit out of time. So on the first question, land reutilization and urbanization and our ability to replicate project, I think what we try to replicate really is the analytics to try to understand what is the cause of the problem that we're facing. So if the problem is that a certain city, and we try to use quite a bit of that evidence-based work. So as I mentioned, analytics to try to understand, and I'll answer two questions together, which is urban sprawl together with densification. As you explain to mayors the implications of a sprawling city in terms of how it reduces people's access to job opportunities within a city because of this widespread dispersal of jobs and the lack of transportation systems. As you start explaining the impact in terms of emissions, in terms of air pollution, in terms of increased commuting time, which means also lost productivity. I mean, in places like Johannesburg or Rio de Janeiro, I mean, you end up living 2 to 3 hours away from your job. So that's 4 to 6 hours of lost productivity per day, or at lost time with your family. I mean, so when you start explaining these types of evidence, you start convincing the policymakers that there is a need to do something about it. And then the solution is, you start looking at mixity of uses and whether you can create mixed land uses, whether you can densify. Do you have the infrastructure that can sustain densification? I mean, because not every parcel of land or not every neighborhood can just be densified if you don't have the water and transportation infrastructure that can sustain that densification. So trying to find the solutions, but on the basis of, if you will, the analytics and the evidence of what the challenge might be, and talking to the mayor. Just like I explained with the governor of Jakarta, being able to show, really in real time how much the city is sinking every year had become a major conversation opener to be able to talk about changing their policies on water abstraction, groundwater abstraction. Communities not aware of their challenges. I think there's a lot of, if you will, professional facilitation in terms of community engagement that can help evoke things. I don't think communities are not aware of their challenges per se. I think sometimes, you might be interested, there might be some considerations of the sort of, not in my backyard, okay, the city needs a landfill, but I don't want it in my neighborhood, or, I'm more concerned about the pothole in front of my street as opposed to maybe a larger challenge. So I think as you start explaining the challenges, especially the complex ones, like as I mentioned, flooding is a combination of an infrastructure, building regulations, garbage collection, and informal settlement and encroachment. So all these factors combined create a problem like flooding. So therefore being able to explain the more complex challenges, but also being able to use, just like they've done in Brazil with the participatory budgeting. I mean, when they go to a neighborhood that's rich and where the, if you will, the property owners are asking for fixing the pothole in front of their street, they start busing people around the city so that they understand the needs in other neighborhoods, and then they discover that actually the favela out there has much more needs, and the pothole of my street, can actually wait because it's really not a priority compared to, the total lack of paved roads in this other neighborhood, etc. So I mean, there's a lot of work to happen with communities to be able to, if you will, raise awareness, if you want, of the more complex and intractable problems. Budgets, I mean, most of these are associated with large-scale operations that we do. I mean, when you start with something like the Resilience Academy, I mean, that's obviously something that is much more about training and capacity building. It's not something that, if you will, alone will replicate, but that we had a big urban resilience program funded by DFID that allowed us to do a lot of this work, and the results are becoming really interesting, and we're capable now of replicating them across Africa. So I mean, budget has never been a constraint. Some of these initiatives are, very cheap, and maybe it answers the question on not having access to the technology and the resources. I mean, some of these, crowdsourcing is a very, very cheap approach. You're harnessing the power of community with, small geolocalization devices that can tell you basically what are the spots where the floods are occurring. Drones are also very cheap in terms of their production of mapping and the way they operate. And in places, things like the CPR, the cell phone records, there's a big agreement between the bank and the GMSA, the Global Mobile, service associations, about the availing of this big data for, if you will, the types of interventions that the bank does in terms of alleviating poverty and boosting shared prosperity. Finally, in terms of curbing urban sprawl, you have to use, the end of the day, you can use lots of draconian interventions. There are countries that have done, if you will, the urban boundary beyond which you shall not, deliver services, or urbanization cannot be sanctioned. But usually, if you have a distorted land market and you impose a boundary like that, all what you're doing is you're artificially bidding the land prices of the properties within, if you will, the boundary. So I think most important thing is to think about the types of incentives. So, as you start thinking, the incentives, putting disincentives to driving, which, promotes sprawl, whether it's through, fuel taxation, etc., subsidizing public transportation, developing, higher density transportation nodes. At the end of the day, it's all about land markets, and to the extent that land markets are distorted, then you will need to start working on unblocking some of those distortions before you start putting draconian measures, to say, anything beyond, kilometer 21 is not going to be licensed or is not going to be provided with infrastructure. So you need to start thinking about a mix of incentives, but also the structural measures to address the distortions in land markets as you start thinking about managing sprawl and creating a density that is actually livable, because there is a density that is unlivable. A density with congestion, with with lack of affordable housing, etc., is not a density that works. So you need, if you will, the density that's managed well and that can bring about the benefits from agglomeration, from productivity, and so on and so forth in terms of poverty alleviation that urbanization brings. And with that, thank you very much, and I wish you a very successful event.